So now that I'm working more on that side, on the importance of having at least differentiated prices for different types of, so say, different qualities of carbon capture based on how long it's can be stored and with how much certainty. Whether it's going to be a kind of forest base that's going to give carbon sequestered low reliability and only for a certain amount of time, in comparison to geophysical storage that's supposed to be for thousands of years and more reliable. So it kind of goes against the notion of having a single carbon price that makes everything more efficient, but like starting to differentiate between types of carbon capture with potentially different price signals, if the price signal was the actual driver of the project.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because it goes against all the tide on trying to get single carbon prices across geographies and across sectors and across to make them all work better and more efficiently.
But isn't the duration for which you're storing the carbon not necessarily inconsistent with that? Because I mean, you'd do the same if you were emitting carbon. You'd take account of. That's not no, it's not quite the same, but it does. I think it's really good stuff. But I agree. Okay, difficult.
Yeah, but it's probably more related to the difference between kind of making the carbon equivalence, sort of saying that methane is equivalent to 20 times or 20 plus times CO2 on 100 years horizon. So there's a lot of discussions to be held on that, if the price was kind of the aim.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's potentially more complicated, but you could have a price for a certain extraction of carbon that would last a minimum of 200 years. And then anything that does less well than that, you could give it a proportionately lower value, I suppose. But I'd like to believe that we actually had a credible large-scale technology for direct extraction of carbon before we get into the sophisticated stuff.
Right. I think we're going to make a start of the presentation, if Maxine is ready.
Okay.
I'll introduce you. I'll read your bio, if that's all right with you. Oh, perfect. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Maxine, for agreeing to present today. Maxine is an experienced regulatory and consumer expert with a particular focus on energy. And she recently left Ofgem after 15 years, during which time she had responsibility for a variety of areas, including consumer policy, retail markets, and smart metering. And most recently, she was a member of Ofgem's executive board, responsible for all aspects of regulation of the distribution networks. And as part of this, she initiated Ofgem's work on flexibility and on the future of gas. Her wide experience at the senior level in Ofgem gives her a strategic view of how the regulator works and of the regulatory challenges associated with the energy transition. Before joining Ofgem, Maxine had a range of roles at BT, including as head of UK regulation. And she has a FITS from Newnham College, Cambridge, in Master Management Science, and an MBA from Cranfield. And she is a Oxford Martin Visiting Fellow. So over to you, Maxine.
Thank you. And I do pop up here from time to time. In fact, it's almost exactly a year ago that I did an initial presentation on this same question. So some people will have seen that, and that helped shape the thinking in the paper that was published, working paper that I published recently. And in fact, John, Ted and Sarah have all read and given me helpful comments on the whole paper. So for them, they kind of know all of this already. but therefore they might hopefully have some more helpful kind of builds and thoughts. But I will try to pitch the presentation for those who are less familiar with the area. So what I can talk about is what's the problem that I'm focused on, and then there are kind of, which is sort of basically particularly around network investment, and then kind of 3 broad areas that I discuss in the paper about how regulators need to up their game in thinking about investment under uncertainty. It's about scoping the uncertainty, it's all about scenario planning, how you actually come up with the options, and then how you decide which options you're going to go with. And then a little bit just at the end about, is anybody going to take any notice of all of this? So it's the problem. The questions I say I've focused on, because it was the area that I was working on at the end of my time in Ofgem, is around long-term network investment decisions. So we need to upgrade the electricity network, and we may or may not need a gas network in future. What do you do about those kind of investments that are inherently long-term when you've got uncertainty about the future pathways? Will we even need a gas network in future? And around the pace of change. How quickly are we going to need a reinforced electricity network, and so on. Ofgem as the regulator has historically had a big worry about stranded investment and the risk that customers will be paying for something that ultimately isn't needed, and really pushing to kind of keep costs to a minimum. But increasingly, and in fact, there was a letter sent from the Secretary of State to Ofgem, kind of really leaning a little bit towards saying, but do remember, we need this. We do not want a lack of network capacity to end up as being a barrier to us achieving net zero. So you've got the regulator who sets price controls for these monopoly networks, trying to balance these quite difficult trade-offs between avoiding unnecessary investment, but making sure you've got the investment there that you need if you're going to achieve net zero. And that's played out over through the Rio price controls. They've just finished doing the price controls for the gas networks and for the electricity transmission networks, which are all incidentally being appealed to the CMA at the minute, but not generally on that big balancing question, more on kind of cost of capital stuff. And they're just kicking off their well, not just kicking off, but they're sort of midway through that process with the companies developing their business plans on electricity distribution, which Ofgem will decide and make its decisions on next year. So a lot kind of going on in that space and how they take these decisions at the minute. The other key player in this is National Grid, who as the system operator do a lot of the thinking about where we need the transmission network, looking at the whole country and where you expect generation to be built and the flows across the network overall. They produce a network options appraisal and basically say, as the system operator, where new transmission investment is going to be needed in future, as a kind of input into Ofgem's ultimate decisions on whether or not to let those investments go ahead. And then, the network companies themselves have to make decisions in developing their business plans and day to day. So there's a lot of people there who need to be kind of finding better ways of thinking about how you deal with these investment questions in the face of that uncertainty. So at the minute, Tom, I'm afraid I'm not talking directly about the questions that you said you were really interested in still and exploring, but we may be able to, through the discussion, kind of branch out, because some of this is about a regulatory mindset that I think has wider application than just network planning, even if that's the lens through which I've come at it. And obviously it's my regulatory background that sort of given me the insights into how regulators currently tend to make those decisions and where I think the changes are needed. So starting with scoping the uncertainty. What I'll do is kind of pause at sort of a few key points through this and maybe open out the discussion rather than go all the way to the end, but I'll do scoping the uncertainty and the next slide, and then have a pause. So how do you think about uncertainty? And generally across companies, and ever since I was a little girl working in BT, scenario analysis has been kind of one of those buzzwords. Shell were the people who did a lot of the initial thinking about it way back when. And the idea is, by trying to kind of come up with kind of coherent stories about the future, you encourage people to think about in slightly to challenge conventional thinking and to kind of push the boundaries of different ideas and different ways that the world could unfold. We have, at one level, we have a positive example, that National Grid, to inform this sort of network options appraisal that they do, produce future energy scenarios, which they update each year. And they put a lot of work into those, engaging with stakeholders, and they produce 4 scenarios. And they've evolved over time. Last year, 3 out of 4 met the net zero target. Previous year, they didn't have any, and they had to kind of add one on because that was just at the point that we moved to net zero. So they kind of evolve depending what the policy climate is. 4 different ways. So their 4 scenarios at the minute are about, is it very much consumer driven with lots of individuals actively engaging and taking up heat pumps because they're consumers and they're all engaged in the journey? Or is it more of a system driven transformation where consumers individually aren't wanting to get very actively involved? And in that kind of a world, their story goes, you would be more dependent on hydrogen because you can kind of do that without customers having to get quite so engaged in all the retrofit on their homes. And then they have inevitably kind of a kind of best of both worlds and a slightly less encouraging one. So kind of 4 broad scenarios, and it varies over time where the drivers, where kind of economic growth sometimes it's fit in as well. And they're really comprehensive, and they look at the gas and electricity network. They look a bit at what's happening with forecast projections on conversions to EVs, and they are, the whole point of them is to be comprehensive and internally consistent, and then they feed those into the detailed network planning models, which they use, as I say, to kind of work out where you're going to have constraints on the transmission network with lots of renewables flowing through. So they model the generation mix as well and have a geographical element to it. So they have, over the years have got quite well known, and everybody will talk about FES in the sign of an acronym, sign of a success. But the problem is they've just become, oh yeah, we do scenario planning, we've got the FES. And as I say, we've got just 4 scenarios. And that's probably all that's manageable when you're doing massive, great modelling for the network options appraisals, but it doesn't necessarily going to capture the more extreme situations. And, I've been clear in the past, you don't want extreme scenarios for modelling for the NOAA, but, at some point, is it really helping you to think in a challenging way, particularly when, in some sense, politically, they all have to meet net zero? Is that really going to prompt the kind of challenging thinking that was behind the original scenario analysis? And one particular example of that is if you look at electric vehicles, then all 4 of the scenarios have pretty well the same number of electric vehicles in the early 2040s. Maybe for the purposes of kind of modelling flows across up and down the country, that doesn't matter too much. But if you're a distribution network operator and you're trying to think about what are the risks in terms of whether or not you're going to need investment in your local network, EVs are a big driver of the assumptions around the level of investment that distribution networks are going to have to take. And the idea that there's kind of, the question is simply about how quickly are we going to get there, which is the difference in the current FES scenarios. They all get to the end point. It's just a question of speed, which then leads you to say, well, it doesn't really matter if we invest a bit more early, it's still going to be needed. But actually, if you're really seriously thinking about the risks and the issues that are faced, you know, there's a huge amount of uncertainty in what's going to happen with electric vehicles. Will we have autonomous vehicles that will go off somewhere else to charge? Will we have shared vehicles, microtransport, more reliance on walking and active travel? What's going to happen with smart charging? All of those things could lead to very, very different patterns of demand on the electricity distribution network. But there is no encouragement for the distribution networks to think about that, because they're just told you need to think about the different FES scenarios, is the edict that comes out from Ofgem. So that's where we are at the minute on scoping uncertainty. And what I'm arguing for is basically we need a more sophisticated approach to scenario planning. It shouldn't be just about the FES. So your scenario should be focused on the question at hand, and that is, you know, that kind of going back to the theory about, you know, the Shell model is there stories that help you think about the problem that you've got, and you're trying to say, well, what could influence whether or not what we do is a good idea or not. So if you're deciding whether or not to invest in the distribution network to respond to EVs, then you need to kind of be asking yourself, well, what might actually happen? What are the ranges of what might happen to EV growth that we have as a key assumption driving our investment, and I think quite radically and about the possibilities in that space. It also becomes then an iterative process. So when you're thinking about that particular question and you've come up with an idea, you're kind of saying, and what could make this a bad idea? So that you're really using that kind of scenario planning process to think about the risks associated with your proposed way forward. So probably just saying the same thing in a slightly different way. It's helpful to have those four kind of core scenarios for planning, but you need to think about more extreme scenarios and how those would be managed. And that to help in getting that wider set of more extreme scenarios, I emphasize the value in stakeholder engagement, because to some extent you often have this sort of group think, we all believe the world's going in a particular direction, and to challenge conventional thinking. One of the examples that I give in the paper is solar PV, which on the previous electricity distribution price control, again, Ofgem said, you know, you should look at the FES scenarios, and none of the FES scenarios had solar PV taking off, and it did take off, and it caused a real headache for the distribution companies because they just hadn't built that into their plans at anything like the scale at which it developed. And I can't help thinking that if instead of being told to think about the FES, they'd been told to think about the things that might change and that might cause pressures on their network, at least they would have had that kind of thinking process. So they would have said, well, you know, and what would we do if solar really took off? Even if they viewed that as unlikely, they would have gone through some of that thinking process to say, and what do we need to do to be ready just in case it does? So that's my pitch on the first area about how regulators need to be a little bit more open-minded and encouraging the companies they regulate to be more open-minded rather than just assuming that we do scenario planning because we've got the FES. So I will pause at that point for any questions or reflections on the kind of how you think about uncertainty part of it. Jose.
So I have a question about who do you think it's better placed to challenge, to propose these challenges and make them explicit within the institution or outside of the institution. So I understand sometimes it's very important to have those roles kind of formally or even informally specified, so that there's so that the challenging is kind of well received and productively received. Should it be kind of the Climate Change Commission? Should it be institutionalization of some university actors putting those challenges, or should it be the industry? Where do you think this engagement should come from, and whether there's the need for something more concrete to be formalized in the process?
I think that's a good question. I mean, the first bit of it, which isn't quite the answer, is that I suppose I'm saying I think it's fine for Ofgem to kind of rely on having its 4 FESs that it has got worked through, or that it's got National Grid to develop and that are used from a kind of planning point of view. I think going back to my idea that your scenario should be focused on the question at hand, there's a little bit of, it's down to the gas networks to think about the implications for their networks of different hydrogen and other futures, and what does that then mean? So, are you going to have heat pumps? It's quite a different impact on your gas network if you have a heat pump installed, en masse on street by street, and then you close down the gas network, or do you have heat pumps, just as customers decide they want them, and you've got to keep your gas network running until the last person has finally agreed that they're going to go on a heat pump. So if you're the gas network thinking about your infrastructure, you're going to be thinking about different kinds of scenarios about how gas might evolve. So I think that the kind of drive for it has to come from the places where those decisions are going to ultimately be taken. It might be that there's some kind of facilitating role that somebody like National Grid could play, so that if they're going to be the people producing the FES, that they can have I mean, they do it through consulting with industry, but I take your point. You could use, a stronger academic panel probably has got people who are thinking a little bit more out of the box, perhaps. So that you could do something that was a bit more structured, that also tried to present their 4 core scenarios plus some kind of radical get people thinking bits around the edge to avoid, otherwise everybody's doing that repeated exercise, which isn't very efficient for each of the networks to be doing it individually. So that's probably as far as my thinking would go on that one, but it's a good question.
Maxine, I had a question, which I guess from my perspective, it seems like if you're talking about the network companies doing planning, then presumably it would relate to the incentives that they're under. And also, I guess with planning, there's one goal is kind of reducing, costs, or improving whatever the kind of welfare metric you have is, over the long term, or over the range of possible things that could happen. But then I guess the other aspect is kind of robustness, or ensuring that there's some reliability in the system, given different things that could happen, or something like that. So I suppose the regulator probably has a role in sort of, imposing, we don't want a kind of very bad things to happen because you've planned badly, or something like that. But I guess, do those 2 things come into this, or?
Yeah, so it maybe comes in a little bit more as well when you get further down about, okay, now you've thought about the uncertainty, how do you then choose which option you're going to go for? But certainly I think the regulator has a role in making sure that the companies have thought widely enough about the different futures that could unfold. And as I say, I think at the minute they're not putting enough incentive on them to do that, because the edict they're giving is you should show how your plans could evolve in response to the different FES scenarios. They're not saying, and you should think about what else might create risks, either to any of those things, either to kind of meaning you've got problems on resilience, or that might mean you've got you've got costs, unnecessary costs being built into the system. So it is very much around that, what what are the incentives and what's the regulator asking of the network companies. Shall I move on?
Can I just, I've had my head in the FES for a few months, actually, for a piece of work that I've been doing with Nick and a few others from the ECI for Oxfordshire County Council. And I've been quite impressed with the FES, because what I like is that there's a lot of data which is accessible, and they do, it is quite open, so you can actually delve right into the depths of all of the figures that they come up with, and that's quite useful. And they do produce kind of outputs which are meant to be used directly for the DFES, for the distribution energy scenarios. But I think what I found quite hard is actually translating that national level picture that the FES produces to kind of local policy, and also how these different kind of scenarios kind of influence each other. And we decided to try to base our analysis for Oxfordshire on the FES, but in some ways trying to correct it for where we think Oxfordshire differs from like the national average, essentially. So if we look at kind of the unique things about Oxfordshire, is that housing growth is much higher than what kind of the national average is, and what we suspect is assumed within the FES. But you kind of get into this weird cycle where they all kind of influence each other, where decisions that are made in terms of policy at a local level are trying to incorporate what the FES is saying. But then you also have this kind of stakeholder engagement, and this is particularly a problem I see between the DFES, is where the DFES is being shaped on what the county councils or other local authorities are telling the distribution networks, and you kind of get in this vicious cycle of they're both informing each other, but also both kind of using each other's kind of scenarios and different planning to do that. And in some ways it could be a positive feedback loop, but I'm sometimes worried that it's actually picking up the errors and then magnifying them. So yeah, I'm not sure really what my point is, but I was quite impressed with the amount of kind of accessible data with the FES. I think the biggest worry for me is when the CCC then kind of published their 6th carbon budget, and it differs quite a lot from what you see in the FES, particularly around like how quickly they assume like the electricity network decarbonizes. And I know the big thing within the FES is by 2035, it's actually like net negative emissions, whereas that's never really ever reached with the 6th carbon budget. And that then has huge impacts on kind of strategies for decarbonizing, because you get some councils that if they just pick up the FES, then it looks like they should just electrify everything and suddenly they've got negative emissions. Whereas it's not the case if you go down the kind of the CCC route, where even by 2050, the electricity network is not fully decarbonized.
Yeah, I suspect they may well, move a bit closer together. So I think for 2021 FES, National Grid BSO will be looking at what the Committee on Climate Change said for the 6th carbon budget, in the same way as this time they moved to having net zero consistent scenarios. And I certainly, totally agree with you. I'm saying it's not just about FES. I think FES is great, and the data and everything else. It's just people think it's the answer to everything, and it's not the answer to everything. And the DFES is, as you say, then just I've seen some DFESs through my involvement in one of the company challenge groups that I sit on, and it is sort of trying to take the same basic concept, as you say, and then ask the local authorities which they think they're going to be on, and they all sort of say, oh yeah, well, we're going to be these ones that I've been involved in, they all want to be on the kind of consumer progression, and consumers are going to be massively engaged, and we're going to have loads of heat pumps, and you kind of go, yeah, where's the government policy that's going to support that? So don't just ask local authorities, because they've all declared climate emergencies, they've all got lots of ambition. but doesn't necessarily mean that's the most likely outcome. So I think there is that bit of feeding in on itself. As I say, I'm also trying to push at there are questions in there that it just doesn't get into at the next level of granularity, because it's on my EV examples. But I wasn't. They're an invaluable resource. I'm not suggesting getting rid of them, but adding to them in terms of some slightly more extreme ideas and CCCs.
Yeah, and I think also, like, I guess guidance on how to interpret them maybe for different stakeholders, I think could be useful.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah,
Angeliki is...
Hi, sorry. So agree, absolutely agree on the thinking about FES is not the answer to everything, but the problem is that for a long time it was the only available view of the future on such a level that could be useful.
Mm-hmm.
In the last year or so, we've been very lucky to have different pathways, different views of the future. You have the CCC, of course, which is at the same all-encompassing level, but you have other things as well. So you have the National Infrastructure Commission's pathways that are very useful for hydrogen, for example. You have the Catapult's views of the world. There is as extreme views as the UK fires one. So I think it's important to know what it is you're looking for, and making sure that you do your work on looking into a wider assumption space, depending on what it is that you're looking to influence or change. I can reassure you that internally in Ofgem, we're not looking at FES anymore. In the last year that I have been involved in that kind of thinking, we have broadened our thinking space a lot. Unfortunately, our thinking doesn't always find its way to the public documents we produce, which is unfortunate and very frustrating for us doing the work. But it is starting to be reflected in the ED2 business plan guidance document, for example. We have asked companies to not just think about FES and CCC pathways, but we've gone to a different approach on uncertainty, which is not just scenario planning, it's actually risk assessment of their own local networks. And that is bringing them together with the local authorities, for example, where they can provide supporting evidence. And we've asked them to provide supporting evidence in their business plans to start bringing all of the relevant parties together and start assessing data from parties of the market that have better knowledge of the market and the needs. Because we have to acknowledge that, as you said, FES doesn't have all the answers, because they don't necessarily, the team producing is not necessarily on the ground as close to every DNO is, and the sort of stakeholder engagement they can have with local authorities. So this is another way of going about uncertainty as well. And we're always on the lookout of improving our understanding. I agree, we need to be looking beyond just FES, absolutely we are. And beyond just, I think we should be looking beyond just scenario analysis if we want to be flexible and quick in making decisions and enabling decarbonisation.
That's helpful, Angeliki, and hello.
Sorry, I was late.
I think that's fine, and you could probably keep saying that, because I think the business plan guidance, certainly the companies I'm involved in, they're doing a lot of wider stakeholder engagement with local authorities and everything else, but it is still they're debating, the thing in the FES language seems, they've all produced de-FESs because they think that's kind of the way that it needs to go in order to inform the evidence that Ofgem's looking for. So anyway, I'm pleased that we're not in disagreement. And as I say, I'm not being critical of FES. It's building on that to think about, as you put it, the wider risk assessments that you need to do. Okay, next stage, if in some sense you've thought about the uncertainty in the world, okay, now you're thinking about your options and what could you do. And it's quite, in some sense, this is what I've called the neglected step in the process. If you read any government things on impact assessment, it always says it's really important to think about the range of options you're going to consider, but there's not a kind of much theory about how you develop options. And the kind of messages that I've got in my paper are firstly about it being an iterative process. So it's not that you think of your options and then you appraise them against the uncertainty and see which one comes best. You kind of, if an option performs poorly under a particular scenario, well, what could you do that would make it into a better option by tweaking it in some way. And I think probably people do that in practice, but it's not, it doesn't tend to be articulated as part of a good process. So again, Ofgem talks about making sure you've got a wide range of options that you're considering, but that kind of idea that this is an iterative process, I think is something that could be helpfully brought out. I've also for some time, and I think I'm talking about this when I presented last year, about real options thinking. Is that so real options, you probably may be familiar with the idea of financial options. You can have a buy option to sort of say, if shares reach a certain price, then I have an option to buy, or an option to put options, an option to sell. You don't have to exercise that option, but you can do. And that kind of financial appraisal technique, of which the basic message is options are more valuable the more uncertainty there is, can be applied to the real world as well. And there's quite a lot of literature out on real options, which is sort of summarised in my paper. And the point there is that you're not trying to take a one-off decision. You are trying to think about the pathway that you will follow and how you will respond as more information becomes available and as the world develops and the situation develops. And that you have then, you can kind of characterize the different options you have at each point about, you can invest to learn, you can expand, you can stop. And so to sort of think of things in that way. So part of my advocating real options thinking is not necessarily that you're going to get a magic number out of the bottom, which we'll come back to later, but it actually just informs a way of thinking about your options. How do you keep an option on the table? What can we do to give ourselves that option going forward? Are the questions that you should be trying to think about as you articulate what it is that you are thinking you might do. And again, engaging with stakeholders to identify a wider set of potential solutions, which is about quite often bringing in the customer side to help you solve the problem, the kind of demand side response and flexibility solutions that Ofgem advocates. So that step around developing options, happy to pause if anybody has anything, otherwise I'll go on to the kind of more meaty bit around how one evaluates options or potential solutions against the different scenarios.
You may be about to cover this, Maxine, but I think options are very interesting, but it's always been a worry to me, even with financial options, that actually to get a real quantitative number out, you need a realistic idea of what the probabilities are. And typically, that's the one thing that you don't have, in other words. So that's why options never do produce the magic number. But there's one other aspect of options I came across somewhere in the literature, which is that a particular issue to pay attention to is not just uncertainty, but also the idea of irreversibility.
Yeah.
And avoiding irreversible decisions is a pretty important criterion.
Yeah, no, that irreversibility concept comes out in my paper as being, in some sense, a network investment is irreversible, whereas a flexibility solution, you can change if demand changes. And I think it might even have been you, John, that put me up to including in my paper the point that emitting carbon into the atmosphere is irreversible.
Yeah, that's much more irreversible than a network investment, because you can at least take the investment out. But
so that kind of they're both important points, and I think I will come on to the kind of the problems of actually putting a number onto option value, but I think my point here is that it's still helpful even as a way of thinking about things, even if you can't go to that final stage of doing the number crunching.
Maxine, can I ask one just kind of technical question, which is, when you sort of say option, is what you have in mind like a yes/no decision? And in that case, I guess I was a bit confused about the part where it was like you could improve an option, or do you like under a scenario, or do you mean you could select a slightly different option?
So I got in I'm getting a muddle because I've got options in. So you're trying to choose between different solutions or proposals, and then within that you might. My real options bit is saying you give yourself options. So I'm saying the networks would be making a decision about, are we going to build this new link from here to the north of our patch, and you could have different solutions that you're kind of evaluating, one of which is, well, we'll best build the first half of the link and then we'll only build the second half if we need it, or we will invest in some flexibility in demand side response, and we'll wait and see whether that investment is needed. And then what we will do is, if demand continues to rise, we will invest at that point, and we'll have a checkpoint in 2 years' time. And another pathway might be, well, we'll just get on and build it now because we think it's going to be needed at some point. So those are the different solutions, and I guess my iterative bit is, almost you get forced into some of those slightly more flexible options by saying, okay, well, we'll just build it now because it's definitely going to be needed. And on all of the FES scenarios, it's needed. And you go, yeah, but actually there is still a risk. Might be small, but there's still a risk that in certain worlds, we're not going to see this growth because we're going to get hydrogen in Scotland. So although there's all this masses of renewables, there is still a risk that at some point we're not going to need a link from Scotland to England because we'll turn it all into hydrogen up in Scotland, and then what would we do? And that forces you then to say, okay, well, maybe actually we shouldn't be going whole hog out to build a link at this stage. We should just be getting to a certain point and then check whether or not hydrogen's developing before we press the final go button. So you sort of, they're not just yes/no decisions. It's lots of different ways of solving the problem about, we need a big transmission link that runs from here to there. Does that make any more sense?
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I think it's I guess it gets into John's thing about when you do that, you're sort of, I guess you're implicitly sort of assigning probabilities to scenarios, but then also there's this thing of like very unlikely events that would have like a big downside potentially, where trying to do that in a probabilistic framework kind of doesn't make any sense, because you kind of get, oh, well, they're extremely unlikely, so we can ignore them kind of thing. But you almost need more of a sort of like, it seems like in engineering, right? You sort of do a more like a kind of risk analysis process of like, what are the terrible things that could happen and how can we specifically avoid those? And then once you've avoided them, on top of that, then you can make probabilistic, cost improving decisions or something.
I think that's beautifully put, Tom. Absolutely. And I think the kind of engineering way of thinking about these things is what needs to be brought into it. So kind of, I sort of say in the paper, it's got quite a lot to do, similar with project management disciplines and other disciplines rather than the kind of conventional financial economic appraisal, but that comes into it. Anyway, so that kind of probably leads in naturally to the next bit on the kind of decision rules and tools. So the current approach that National Grid use when they're looking at their network options appraisals across different, what big transmission links do you need across the country is a thing called least worst regrets decision rule, which I've put the steps on the slide of how you do it, and I'm not going to go into it because it's kind of part of my point is it's kind of quite a complicated process, of calculating a thing called regret and then maximising the least regret is first of all quite hard to get across to stakeholders. But one of the merits of it has always been, back to Tom's point, you, in theory, don't need to put probabilities onto the different scenarios. You're just kind of comparing and minimising this sort of measure of regret across the different scenarios. And I did talk about it a bit more a year ago, and there's quite a good, my paper kind of pulls out all of the arguments. There are kind of theoretical problems with it as a methodology, which is if you add in another option, it can change your choices. And I quote in my paper the story that John told last time, that it's like going into a restaurant and you choose, you're going to have, I don't know, place on the menu, and then the waiter says, "Oh yes, but did I tell you, sir, that we've got special on today of salmon?" And you say, "Oh, in that case, I'll have the beef." So there's a sort of, there are some theoretical issues with least worst regrets. And in fact, although I've been very rude about it, it was amused to see, so Ofgem actually commissioned some academics to review their general approach to uncertainty, who were equally rude about least worst regrets, saying that such techniques survive solely, perhaps that they allow simple exercises given to students in elementary OR courses. So I felt vindicated that I was not the only person that was being critical of it as a methodology. And I think there's the least worst regrets that's used by National Grid in developing its network options appraisal, but that whole language of regrets, low and no regrets, is a framing that gets used a lot of the time in saying, well, how are we going to approach the problem of investing under uncertainty? Well, let's focus on the low and no regrets decisions. Well, clearly, if something is low and no regrets, that's great. We probably should do it. But my worry is that it translates too readily into low and low cost unless you are properly building in the impacts of not meeting net zero or of not having enough capacity on the network for resilience points of view, that you have to be building in the impacts of underinvestment equally into your NPV calculations in order to ensure that you are properly doing a low and no regrets and not just low no cost. I also have a small hobby horse about this. The aim should not be to minimise the regulator's regret. Quite often regulators will be concerned not to make decisions that they then subsequently get criticised for, but that is not the aim. The aim is to do what's best for customers. So that's a kind of saying that's where we are at the minute. Least worst regrets has been used historically and widely for that kind of investment appraisal, and the no and low regrets framing is been kind of regularly used by Ofgem. The Zachary et al. Paper that I mentioned earlier that Ofgem had commissioned actually advocate instead use of what they call robust decision making. So you're not trying to kind of come up with a single rule that says we are going to do this sort of least worst regret that produces a turn the handle and a mechanistic answer comes out, but that what you're trying to do is to find decisions that perform well under all scenarios or avoid decisions that perform poorly under particular scenarios? Is this sort of robust decisions that are going to serve you well however the future unfolds, rather than trying to absolutely optimize a particular measure of regret? And again, you know, they talk about it being an iterative process, what I was saying about refining options. So if you've got something that looks good but performs poorly under one scenario, you can go back and sort of, how do we refine it? While the virtue of least worst regrets is that you don't have to assign probabilities, there's another paper that's arguing that implicitly you're assuming therefore that all the scenarios are equally likely, and that actually, you know, we do know sometimes people will have some insight on relative likelihood of scenarios, and that, you know, it would be wrong to ignore that if we have got a view. And so that this robust decision-making process, the particular variant of it that the paper talks about, the RAND approach, depends on doing lots and lots of model runs to kind of learn what matters. So which scenarios, you know, which elements of different scenarios have most impact, and you know how you do the valuation and so on. I don't know. I'll come on to that in a minute. But they also then, you know, so they're using the models to learn and to sort of think about the interactions of different scenarios and different ways forward, but emphasis strongly on the fact that you then have to use judgment. Decision makers have to apply judgment when you're faced with this kind of large scale uncertainty. You should be using the models as a decision aid, not as a mechanistic kind of decision rule. And I think for me that's a core set of messages. So, you know, I was very much that was where my thinking was going, and I was very pleased when I saw the paper that Ofgem had commissioned that really is arguing in a similar direction to where my thinking was going. I think what I do is pull out a few twists on that, which is I think judgment is really important, and has, you know, you have to apply judgment. You can't just expect a black box solution on complicated issues like this. But that we have to be careful that judgment is not just based on past experience when we've got a very different world going forward. So judgment sometimes will be, judgment is shaped by experience, and therefore can lead you to some wrong conclusions. So there's a little bit of just how you sort of get decision makers to think in slightly different ways about the importance of resilience, whether the last bit of efficiency really matters, or whether having some spare capacity is valuable in an uncertain world because it gives you some flexibility, is a different bit of judgment to there's always a bit of more efficiency we can squeeze out of the system. So judgment is important, but it needs to have a new set of kind of principles that inform some of that judgment. And some of that comes from again, stakeholder input. I think on models, I can understand when you've got the something complicated like the National Grid trying to do a model of the whole electricity network for the whole country and working out where constraints are going to arise over time and by geography in different scenarios. That requires a big model. But sometimes, and again, I've got some examples in the paper of other academics who've made the point that you know, models can sometimes, you go build a really, really complicated model, and then Rand are talking about running the model lots of times so you can see what matters. Actually, sometimes a simpler model, it may be it'll be less precisely right, but it may actually be a lot easier to understand what's going on, and it'll be roughly right rather than precisely wrong. So kind of trying to encourage people, models help structure your thinking, but don't have to always have a very complex model. that sometimes that kind of complexity and having a decision rule provides a kind of false comfort that you've got this really sophisticated model and this has given this answer, and therefore you kind of think as a regulator, therefore that's right, whereas actually something that's a little bit simpler that you can really understand, you can probe its assumptions, will enable you to make a better decision at the end of the day. So I have come out not really particularly advocating, it's not like I'm advocating a specific technique. I guess robust decision making is a set of principles. I'm pulling out from that the idea that we want robust decisions rather than that we want to minimize a particular obscure metric called regret. But that a lot of what it ends up saying is more about the decision-making process than about the specific rules that you can use, of which there are many. There are many variants of least worst regret, mini max, maxi min, etc. And the paper talks about some work that National Grid had done looking at all the different kind of models that are out there, the different decision rules, and how they would end up. They give you different decisions, depending whether you want a risk-averse decision or a more optimistic decision. I think all of those things are very much where the judgment needs to come in, and that one should not be delegating such decisions to a black box. So perhaps pause again at that point. Just keeping an eye on we're nearly out of time and we're nearly at the end, but any reflections on that last bit?
I guess, Maxine, just a question about input, not just from different models for learning, but from actual on-the-ground experience of trying to get flexibility going. Speaking as someone working on the demonstrator project.
Absolutely, and I guess that's where when I'm saying reiterate the value of external stakeholder input, I guess probably that external stakeholder input, I'm thinking of those on the ground who've got experience of doing this stuff. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, and I mean, would you count the network operators as being external stakeholders here?
So I think I guess it's a case of, I've talked about different levels of decisions, haven't I? So if Ofgem's a decision maker, then the networks are external. When the networks are trying to make decisions, then inherently they need to look more widely. But Ofgem needs to be looking beyond the networks. That's what you're getting at. Yeah.
I guess sometimes it's a little hard to know at what point you best input, because if you're doing a demonstrator, there can be really quite small. You have to put together a whole lot of small decisions and get a whole lot of chain of relationships going often to make something happen. And at what point you've got enough of a finding to be worth talking about with Ofgem, I guess, is a bit of a question. But just trying to convey that what's involved in making something happen that can look rather simple on a model does seem important.
Yeah, and I mean, my argument on that one would be, I would like to see Ofgem, more engaged in some of those, trying to understand and just see what's happening on the ground on those things as part of their learning. So if I back to this emphasis on judgment, that judgment is only going to be informed by having an understanding of what's out there, as it were. Yeah. So to tune their antennae, so they can help kind of recognise risks and issues. Then I think really engaging with those kind of big pieces.
Yes, I think that's the thing, and it is great to have Ofgem on our stakeholder advisory board, certainly.
But I would, I talk about this some on the PIFA advisory group as well, but how you actually get even the senior level, Jonathan Brearley and others, to kind of, I think they'd be interested. They're just very busy. So there is.
I guess I'm thinking the main thing to talk about is if in a demonstrator there is something that you keep coming up against, in the regulatory environment that continues to be either particularly helpful or particularly obstructive. It's trying to single out those things that recur quite a lot. Yeah.
Okay.
Do we have time for a question?
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to get your view on the point of cost. So, as you know, one of the biggest questions, not just for us, but for government, is who pays in the end for all of this? And we know for a fact that costs will go up. So when I say costs, I mean, from our perspective, of course, our interest is on the effect on bills. So our remit is to look out for consumers. And we know for a fact that they'll have to bear some of this cost. So I suppose, just putting in context the messaging around keeping costs low, that is not to say we don't know that costs will go up for sure. We just want to keep an eye on them and keep them managed. I suppose that's where the context come in terms of messaging. But the question is, I'm very interested in everybody else's opinion as well. How do we manage this? How do we balance this in terms of, because essentially all of this decision making is decision making that will impact on who pays for this. And bearing in mind that consumers at the moment are the ones footing the bill because the government hasn't come out with something else just yet, although I think they are thinking about reviewing this. How do we find a balance is my question. And I'm really keen on everybody's opinion on this.
Happy to let others go in if somebody else wants to chip in.
Well, one aspect is tariffs, isn't it? I mean, it depends what the cause of the, possibly depends on what the cause of the, approximate cause of the network upgrading is. And you might want a different approach as between investment in networks that are done primarily for electric vehicles, where consumers are likely to be relatively insensitive to price increases, and investments that are necessitated by heat pumps, where price sensitivity for heating is likely to be a lot higher. I mean, that's just one aspect of it, I guess.
I think also price sensitivity could be one of the pain points in the various models, so that if the price gets beyond a certain level, then someone either exercises judgment and says, look, this is not going to be viable. So also building into price considerations into these various models might be an option.
I think the bit is in your, advocating as well more engagement by Ofgem in the kind of consumer research, whether it's the value of loss, updating the value of lost load based on more research, so that you've got a framework. So apart from, I'm saying there's a lot of emphasis on judgment, but actually in some of the trade-offs, you do need to have a sense of what customers are willing to pay for. There are tools for kind of getting a handle on that. But it's a difficult question. I do know. So just very quickly, because at the end of time, the kind of real options theory we touched on before, a lot of work kind of really showing this, which I can't do, but people have, Gareth Strabak, for example, done a lot of work actually demonstrating that if you could do a real options approach, or even just a probabilistic kind of decision tree models, will that conventional CBA doesn't capture the option value, and that these kind of decision tree techniques can. And so there's papers that demonstrate that if you really want to show the real value of flexibility, demand side response and storage, you need a different analytical framework for doing that. So that's kind of, I did talk through last time, decision trees that sort of allow you to to show, roll forward and show how you're taking decisions at different points in time, and which is also called adaptive planning in water. So climate change, climate adaptation has done quite a lot of thinking about how you value or how you plan, taking account of different uncertainties about how much impact we're going to have from climate. So replacing the Thames barrier, if seawater levels rise a long way, we need to move the Thames barrier a long way out. If they don't rise very much, we don't have to move it so far. We don't know at this stage, but what they've done is effectively bought the land so that they've got the options of building it in either place. That kind of thinking is what we're talking about. And the very bottom, the DEFRA Green Book guidance, Treasury Green Book, tells people how they should do their investment appraisals, argues that, this is looking at adaptation, but it applies to network investment as well, that even if you can't put a number on that option value, and Strabak and others have shown that you can, but it's quite complicated, even if you can't do that for individual projects, just recognising that a project that gives you flexibility because you can change direction downstream is more valuable than one that isn't. So if there isn't much difference in price, you'd go with the one that gave you more flexibility. So you just remembering all the way through that there is a value in that option value in that flexibility to amend and adapt your plans as you go forward. Really pleased that Angeliki's joined us, because I do think there's an interest in this question in Ofgem. I say in my paper that actually by allowing funding for pre-construction work on transmission, which is the kind of doing all the surveys and everything else, that's exactly the sort of thing that it might be wasted money if the projects don't go ahead, but it's that bit of giving you that option. It keeps the options on the table. So it's a bit like the speaking in prose, but you don't know it. You Ofgem are actually doing a little bit of real option valuation there by allowing pre-construction works. So I'm hoping that Ofgem will have an interest in this kind of area. It is of interest across other sectors. I talked to Catherine Ross about it when she was having moved across from Ofwat to BT, could see the interest in other sectors. And I think more generally, the pandemic has raised the issue of managing uncertainty more widely. So I end up with 2 slides, which I put up last time from the beginning of the pandemic. There is a problem. I feel sorry for policymakers. They will get slammed whichever way they go. Do you kind of make sure you've got that flexibility, you prepare for some uncertainty by building Nightingale hospitals which aren't needed? Doesn't mean it was the wrong thing to do, and you will get flack as well if you failed to stockpile, but you could have equally been criticised for having kind of large amounts of PPE that was going to waste. So they're difficult decisions for regulators in any sector and policymakers, but I'm hoping that the kind of ideas that I put in my paper provide a bit of a steer for policymakers as a way to navigate through uncertainty. That's me done.
Thank you, Maxine. That was a pretty good discussion, I think. I've posted the link to the paper as well in the chat if anyone wants to download that, have a look. Yeah. If there's any final comments or thoughts.
Ted's got a comment about to move to AI and how we retain the value of human judgment moving forward.
That's
which I think
a good question. I'm not sure we've got time to.
No, I'm not suggesting we're trying to answer it. just going to give a nod to it being a good question.
I think we're far away enough from that not to worry about it so much.
Certainly from Ofgem.
Realistically, no, I was talking about networks altogether, but yeah, sure.
But when I was there in Ofgem, I do remember the operations team saying, why do can't we just get AI doing some evaluation of the plans or something? Which obviously wasn't going to work, but.
I'm still employed, so we don't have any AI. I can tell you that much. Otherwise, that would be needed. I lose my job. Oh no. Great. Thanks very much. Sorry, I have to.
No, thank you for joining us.
All right.
Good to see everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Maxine. And everyone else.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. That's
great.
great.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Mhm.